Good to see you. Happy Mother's Day. Um, and I really am looking forward to our conversation this morning. We are going to be exploring this deeper truth of the Great Mother. I like to do this sort of every Mother's Day. It's a wonderful opportunity to explore world spirituality and see the teachings and the hidden nuances behind this notion or archetype of the Great Mother. And so we're going to be doing that today. And it's going to be a bit of a story time in the beginning, and then we're going to get into some of the more practical, deeper, personal, spiritual ways to apply the teaching of the Great Mother. And so I'd like to begin kind of within our own backyard, so to speak, in this Judeo-Christian, now Islamic worldview that our Western civilization has been operating with for many centuries, if not millennia now. And we know within the Abrahamic traditions, as they're also known, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that they are, if you think about them at first blush, they are staunchly patriarchal, if not toxically masculine, to use that phrase. That we see very little evidence of the mother within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But if you do some digging, you'll find that to be very different. And so we're going to be looking at first this notion of Judaism in light of the hidden or the lost presence of the mother. If you're familiar with the history of Judaism, biblical history, there were two temple periods. The first temple was designed and built through the reign of King Solomon. And that was about 900 BC. Right? So Solomon took over David's commission of building the temple. His father was King David. Built the temple. And this is really one of the earliest stratas of Judaism that we can find. It's really been referred to by scholars as sort of the carryover of the patriarchal traditions, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These were like the founding pillars of the Jewish faith, or the monotheism that became Judaism. So in the Temple of Solomon, we have this anomaly now that we look back thinking everything was monotheistic, that within the Holy of Holies, there was actually not only the presence of the ark, but this presence of what would be the tree, or in Hebrew, the Asherah. And this was the mother. She was the tree. And we're going to look at how in the earliest teachings of Judaism, First Temple Judaism, there was the binary couple of Yahweh and the mother. In fact, there are many books written. We're going to be consulting two of them by Margaret Barker. But just an aside quickly, we're going to also see how that First Temple Judaism gets picked back up in early Christianity. This is why, not the adoration, but the worship of Mary seems like, how can first century Jews that were brought up on monotheistic Judaism have a mother goddess now that they are worshiping as, this divine figure? And it's because what Margaret Barker shows in her 19 books is that you have the tradition from First Temple Judaism resuscitated, brought back into early Christianity. So the mother of God features again as part of the original construct or constitution of this First Temple early Judaism. It was eradicated. The mother was thrown out of the temple. Her Asherah pole was burned around 623 BC by King Josiah, and they kind of rewrote history. So when you look at biblical writings, these were created and edited within these scholarly circles. And so the scholars when they returned from the Babylonian exile, they basically rewrote their history. And so what Margaret Barker does as this Cambridge-trained scholar, she goes back into the text and sees how they're changing words, adding letters, leaving things out that she'll then find in the Qumran, better preserved teachings that were also available now that we dug up the Dead Sea Scrolls. And she's bringing to light the fact that there was the mother of the Lord, as one of her books has illustrated. Before we do get into a little bit of what Margaret Barker is going to share with us this morning, just this idea of mother, right? We get the word mater, right? Let's do a little etymology, a little wordplay here. Mater, matra, measure. These are all mother words. In fact, when we go into India, we have this idea of Maya. It's a feminine power, right? Often referred to as the power of illusion or magic. And what Maya actually means is she who measures. Metra, meter. Matra, mother. And also this idea of measurement was understood at a very primitive stage of our human history, where the menses of women were used as a time clock. It was in correspondence with the phases of the moon, and so women were also connected to the moon, to measurement, to time, right? So all of this has very deep, archaic roots within the psyche. Also, this understanding of ocean or sea. So in French, mare, in Italian, mere, in Hebrew, mayim. And this ma is featured throughout. In fact, when you look at the Hebrew letter mem, it means water, mayim. And in fact, the cipher of the Hebrew letter mem looks like a wave coming up from the ocean, if you ever look at the Hebrew letter mem. And then you have Moses' sister Miriam, right? Miriam. And it means bitter sea or drop of the sea. And then you have Jesus' mother, Miriam, right? So here you have all of these mems and meres and mares and meters and mayas, and they all weave together as this notion or this insight of the great mother. The mother is the one who measures out, the one who unpacks the hidden potential. She's the creatrix, the procreatrix. Again, if we go to India, she is the prakriti, the procreatrix. And so everything that's manifesting is manifesting through the Shakti, the power of the great mother. And so we're going to see when we get into Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga how beautifully this plays out. But for now, we're still within the Abrahamic traditions. And just a little bit from Margaret Barker. So she's saying, and quite insightfully, that when you look at the end of the New Testament, you have this new heavens and new earth, this new temple is here, and the tree of life is back in the Holy of Holies. The tree of life, remember, is the Asherah pole, the mother. She's taken out at the end of time, says John the Divine, at the end of the New Testament, the mother's back in the Holy of Holies, right? And there's a new heavens and a new earth. This is all going to play out quite nicely when we get into Aurobindo's yoga. And then she says, there had been a menorah in the second temple. It was depicted on the Ark of Titus as part of the loot taken from the temple when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 CE. Why then did tradition imply that the menorah was missing from the second temple and would be restored by the Messiah? And she goes on to say that the great changes to the temple and its furnishings happened in the time of Josiah. As we shall see, the Old Testament texts do not mention the tree of life or the menorah being removed from the temple, but the centerpiece of the purges done by the king, right? He wanted to basically rewrite the tradition. There was a very strong movement to masculinize Judaism. And so we had to get rid of the mother. And within the Holy of Holies, too, remember the mother also has many sons, many children. So this idea of the many sons of God, these angelic divine beings, right? You'll see that again in the book of Revelation with the 24 elders around the throne in the Holy of Holies. So the destruction of an ashra, known elsewhere as a tree-like object, was one of the things that was part of these reforms. Others remembered that the Queen of Heaven had been abandoned at this time, and that capital W, wisdom, right? In Greek, we get the word wisdom as Sophia, which features as a goddess in the Gnostic teachings, right? Sophia. So wisdom, another name for the mother, had been rejected. There had been a lady in the Holy of Holies, capital L, lady, right? The Queen of Heaven, one of the titles of Mary, the Queen of Heaven. There had been many attempts to remove her. Imagery in the Hebrew Scriptures suggests that Josiah's was the last of many attempts to remove her, and that he was successful because the Babylonians destroyed the temple a few years later. Imagine the lady's great tree dragged from the temple on the holy mountain and burned. And then the proclamation of a new style of religion that recognized only Yahweh and not the lady. This memory shaped the story of Moses on the holy mountain, who heard a voice from a burning bush or tree, telling him that the God of the fathers would from that time be known as Ehyeh, or Yahweh, the Lord. It shaped Ezekiel's picture of the guardian cherub who abused wisdom and so was cast from the holy mountain and burned to ashes on earth. And it goes on saying how other prophets pick this up. Finishing here. A vast spectrum of material points to this pattern of events. And in this first volume, I shall present evidence for the lost lady of the first temple and for her first exile. She was removed from texts by the work of ancient scribes and the assumptions of biblical scholars. In the second volume, I shall show how she survived during the time of the Second Temple, which was the temple erected during the time of Jesus, and how her temple was finally restored by the Christians. Right? I'm a nerd, so I'm finding this all fascinating. If you guys are glazing over and falling asleep, I apologize. But to me, this is like, scandalous in terms of theology and what we've inherited, and really what we consider to be these bedrock dogmatic truths that are on very shifting sands. So that's one of the reasons that when I was in seminary over 25 years ago, I was blown away at the mythological picture that we get, theologically speaking, from mainstream religion. And then when you study it at a deeper level, it's a completely different reality. And so we as a part of the waking up process, we talk about this existential breakdown, right? Where the myths, to loosely quote Voltaire, the myths will no longer hold. No more myths. We have to get to this existential, visceral, phenomenological reality, this deeper being. And we cannot allow dogma and ideology to block us. And what's beautiful about our talk today is that this notion of the mother or the great lady is this very loving, nurturing presence, which is at the core of our journey inward, right? So when we undo dogma and ideology, we're not undoing the great presence that is being symbolized oftentimes by the dogma and ideology. We actually get to the experience of it rather than a dim, bastardized picture of it. Is that clear? So in no way am I robbing the notion of the Great Mother from our minds. In fact, wanting to bring it into a greater amplification and realization. Right? And so oftentimes there is a deconstruction and realization process that has to take place. So a little bit more here from Margaret Barker. The lady of the first temple was remembered as the Virgin and as Miriam, and her many titles and roles survived. We do not know how or where, and these roles appeared intact in the Marian devotion of the early church. The first Christians knew, taught, and believed far more than is recorded in the New Testament, and so tracing the lady is often a matter of listening for echoes, watching for shadows, and piecing together the shards of history. Above all, it is a matter of spotting where Hebrew texts have been changed by the so-called restoring scribes, whose role was to remove shameful things from Scripture. At some stage, one letter was changed here, or a word was added there, and so the mother was erased. She was the mother of the Lord. John saw her appear again in the Holy of Holies, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She gave birth to the Messiah. And then to close out the section, she quotes the Wisdom of Solomon, which is considered this intertestamental book between the Old and the New Testaments, right? Wisdom is radiant and unfading, and she is easily discerned by those who love her, and is found by those who seek her. She hastens to make herself known to those who desire her. He who rises early to seek her will have no difficulty, for he will find her sitting at the gates. To fix one's thought on her is perfect understanding, and he who is vigilant on her account will soon be free from care. Because she goes about seeking those worthy of her, and she graciously appears to them in their paths and meets them in every thought. A little more wordplay before we leave behind this first volume of the Mother of the Lord. I know you're kind of chomping at the bit to know that this was written in 2012. She just came out in December of 2023, late last year, with volume 2. So you can go on Amazon after service and pick up both volumes if you'd like. But before we leave this book, I did want to mention, we have this divine name that the early patriarchs used, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These are, remember, the original guys that got the revelation that later became Judaism. And their encounter with God was oftentimes through the divine name El Shaddai, right? And El Shaddai was translated into the King James Bible as the Almighty, right? Not really what the word means. In Hebrew, Shaddai actually means breast. And the Shaddai, the AI ending, is a dual ending. So it's El, the God, with breasts. And this was the original encounter with the Queen of Heaven. So you have this very strong goddess worship from the very earliest stages of Judaism. And she was big on fertility, etc. Right? So this is why Abraham had a wife that couldn't bear children. Isaac had a wife that couldn't bear children. Jacob had a wife that couldn't bear children. So El Shaddai, the goddess of fertility, was they were very strongly devoted to her. Another interesting thing about the idea of Shaddai, if you shorten it to Shed, which is really the core root of the word, it means fearsome. And so you have this other notion of the goddess of fertility and the goddess of war. You see this picked up with Athena, with Kali in India, right? Kali is the fierce mother. And at the same time, with Sri Ramakrishna as the greatest devotee of our modern times, she was also the very loving and nurturing mother. And so you have this going on with this notion of mother. She is nurturing and she is fierce to protect and her young and her love, right? So we're going to touch in a little bit. I told you it's story time in the beginning, so bear with me. We're going to touch in a little bit on Christianity and how it picked up this idea of the mother through the Mary or Marian tradition. If you go into the symbology of that temple of Solomon, this is something fascinating, and if you took the Bible class with me, you've heard this before. The high priest, we're told in the book of Exodus, was to have an inner garment of white linen, and his outer garment was to be of 4 colors, right? Purple, red, don't quote me on this one, purple, red, and deep blue. And when you go into the temple, there was the veil of the temple with the same 4 colors that the high priest had. And once a year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would take off the multicolored robe and go beyond the multicolored veil and enter the Holy of Holies, which was considered the time beyond time, right? The eternal now. And he would be in his angelic body, the white garment, right? His light body. And the 4 colors that he was wearing that he took off were the 4 elements. And so the veil is the veil of the elements. And so they had this within their understanding. So now keep this in mind when we have in the infancy Gospel of James, right? This is an early Christian book that didn't make it into the New Testament. But in the infancy Gospel of James, let me say this first. The high priest would come out of the Holy of Holies and put on the elemental garment, right? And he would be considered or called Yahweh. And this is something interesting if you really pay close attention to the biblical teachings. He would be called Yahweh, and he would have just come from the mother of the Lord. And so he's putting on the elements, and he's incarnating as the great high priest, the angelic being that is now clothed in the elements or incarnated. And he was given birth by the great lady or the great mother. The infancy Gospel of James has a young Mary, and she was born of a priestly family, we know this, and she's actually living in the temple precincts. And her job, because we know this too, I'll read this part of it. Her job was to knit the new veil. So they were doing restoration on the second temple when Mary was there. And one of the things that they were restoring was that veil of elements, right? So here you have Mary sitting down, and her task given to her was to knit the veil. Now, Mary was one of the young women chosen to weave the new temple veil. She was given the purple and red wool to spin, and as she was working, the angel Gabriel appears to her. And here's the annunciation. You're going to give birth to a son. Thus she was making the new temple veil while she was pregnant. The angel speaking to Mary as she was spinning became the icon of the Annunciation. It is possible that this was just an early legend linking the incarnation and the veil. But given that Herod was refurbishing the temple at that time, it is entirely possible that Mary had been a temple weaver working on the new veil. So picture this. You have the divine incarnation now conceived within her womb, and she's knitting the elements around the angelic, the divine body of Jesus as she's knitting the threads of the temple. And so this is the symbology given of the Great Mother. Again, redo, right? Okay. So we had Judaism and Christianity. Now finally here, Islam, just a little bit about the mother element within Islam. All but 2 or 3 surahs or chapters of the Quran begin with the Bismillah, right? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of the all-merciful and the all-compassionate. And so when you look at the Bismillah in the name of Eracham, Erachim, the Rakam, Rakim, actually means womb. So in the name of the womb of compassion, in the name of the womb of the all-merciful. This is how every revelation, bar 3 chapters of the Quran, begins, right? So hidden in plain sight is this womb-like quality of the revelation of Allah, right? On a more controversial note, just to touch in on this, we all know Salman Rushdie, yes? Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses in 1989, and he actually lost an eye a couple of years ago because of it, right? Remember this? This was a big thing back in 1989. In fact, the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa to have Salman Rushdie assassinated for writing the Satanic Verses because it exposed the Quran as maybe having some flaw to it. I'll get into what the Satanic Verses are in a moment. You also had somewhat a newly converted Cat Stevens on a talk show. You could maybe find this on YouTube. And Cat Stevens was on this panel of secular and Muslim people that were being asked about this fatwa. And, you know, the peace train had stopped, I think, at that point because he was really trying to adhere to the tenets of his new faith. And when asked if he were to see Salman Rushdie in public, would he go to kill him? He had to say yes. So this was an idea that nobody can desecrate Muhammad or the Quran. But the Satanic Verses was actually not made up by Salman Rushdie. It actually occurs in one of the surahs of the Quran, one of the chapters of the Quran. And it's said that in the Saudi Arabian desert where they had the Kaaba, you know, that black cube, where they all do their Hajj, they circle around the Kaaba in a counterclockwise manner. Inside the Kaaba are all of the idols that the early tribes of Saudi Arabia worshipped. And featuring within that pantheon were 3 main goddesses, Allat, Manat, and Al-Uzza. And it was given Muhammad a revelation that these goddesses were also worthy of devotion. And later on, the propaganda that kind of followed after these ideas was that Muhammad, because of his love for the tribes of that early movement, Islam was just getting off the ground. The tribes were still really strongly identified with goddess worship. Muhammad, out of his love for them, wanted to give them a way into the new revelation, and so he praised the goddesses. And then later on, he believed that it was Satan that got into his mind to say that these goddesses were worthy of adoration or devotion. That's why they're called the Satanic Verses. And so this notion of the goddess really cannot exist in a blatant form within the teachings of Islam, at least as we know it now. Just a little bit here about this notion of the archetype, right, of the Great Mother. So this is Carl Jung's Psychology and Religion, East and West. Just came out in paperback in March, if you're interested. And Jung, as you know, believed that humankind shares this collective unconscious. So when the Great Mother appears, like we were saying, within India, within Israel, within Egypt, and they all have the baby in the arm, at the breast, this is not sharing cultures necessarily at the surface level. It's because deep down we all have this drive, these archetypes, these hidden impulses to manifest these potentials of divine consciousness in a certain way. And so that's why they appear across the globe where cultures aren't even in contact with one another, but they do have the same motifs, the same symbols. And it's in Jung's theory it's because we all share this deeper unconscious, this connection to these archetypal forms of the Great Mother. And so he had just finished a conversation here about Mary and how the church eventually had to accept Mary, and then not knowing the new scholarship, of course, of Margaret Barker and others. And then he says this: thus the archetype reasserted itself, right? The Great Mother archetype. And archetypal ideas are part of the indestructible foundations of the human mind. However long they are forgotten and buried, always they return, sometimes in the strangest guise, with a personal twist to them, or intellectually distorted, but continually reproducing themselves in new forms, representing the timeless truths that are innate in man's nature. Right? So don't we see this today in our woke culture? Right? The woke idea is, the girl boss. Right? The girl boss comes into these movies now, and she's maybe 5'4", 120 pounds, and she is beating the heck out of these 6'7", 280 football guys, flipping off the walls and kicking them in the head, and they're going down. And so we have this archetype of the warrior female emerging within film, within TV shows, etc. I would posit that there's a bit of a distortion there, but the archetype itself is still trying to come through, right? Always trying to surface itself, right? And it's really the pendulum swing. Like, so as we saw with Judaism, we see it throughout our culture. I mean, what was it? Was it 1930 that they passed a law in England where women can finally own property? The suffrage movement of the late 19th century. So women have had to struggle to have a voice and a place, the honoring of the mother as a real legitimate job or true function of society. It got really poo-pooed, like the 1980s. It's like, both parents had to go to work now. Mothering became sort of a second-class occupation. All of this stuff is part of our fabric of our 21st century culture. And so what we're having to do is allow this pendulum to swing a little bit further off into, what's called the girl boss or the Mary Sue, where all the women now are just, from the womb, just they know it all, they have it all, they're stronger than all the men. All the men are idiots. Like, watch these movies, all these popular movies. It's just rampant, right? That's the swinging of the pendulum. Eventually, it's going to come to balance, where it's not going to be a toxic feminism, nor, as Carl Jung had mentioned back in the 1950s or earlier, that women who were going to university and who were trying to enter the workforce and be these self-actualized individuals, Jung cautioned that they had to find their own feminine empowerment. What Jung was seeing coming down the pike is what we're seeing now in our culture. Women think by being masculine that this is their power. I mean, we saw this in the desecration of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings when Amazon made Rings of Power. They took Galadriel, which is like the Lady of the Temple or Mother Mary, the most powerful magician, the most pure and feminine archetype in the Tolkien lore, and they made her a warrior bitch, right? And it desecrated the feminine archetype. So this is the swing, and we're having to come back, right? We're having to come back to see what Jung saw, that it's not women being the animus, not masculine, not having to be the warrior, covered in blood and full of masculine toxicity, but actually embodying the power of their femininity. Right? That's where, things will find their balance and their middle way, I think. I need a breath. So this is Sri Aurobindo's little book, The Mother. And Sri Aurobindo is an interesting figure. He was born in India. He went to school at King's College, Cambridge, was a scholar in a European sense, man of letters, came back to India and to his native Bengal, and he was a political revolutionary. He wanted to free India from British rule. He did that very successfully. In fact, his bust is at the Indian Parliament as one of the great revolutionaries of India. Mahatma Gandhi tipped his hat, Rabindranath Tagore, all of the early leaders of the Indian freedom movement all recognize Aurobindo as their inspiration. But when he was arrested for his political revolutionary activities, he had a divine experience in jail. And he realized that operating on the surface level and trying to end oppression and empire amongst bodies is not the way to go. He had this deeper insight. He was lit up with a nirvanic experience, and God, etc., began to pour into him. And he wrote this book because he saw over time that it was the Divine Mother or the Shakti or this creatrix power that was moving all things, right? As we read in the Tao Te Ching a couple of weeks ago, Lao Tzu as this child was different than ordinary people. He was alone an idiot that knew he didn't know. And he was carried through life by this Tao or this way. And he says, I'm not like ordinary men. I drink from the great mother's breasts, right? Remember this? And so this is the idea of the great mother's energy moving all things, moving us, right? Moment by moment, the power, the Shakti, the presence of the mother enters every thought, takes care of everything. But in order for us to experience this is where we're going with Aurobindo's teaching. We don't experience this. Why don't we feel this nurturing, this hidden support, this presence of grace within our life, within our heart? So Aurobindo says, well, personal effort is required. And this personal effort, when we first start out, what's required is our aspiration, one, right? So 3 things are required: aspiration, rejection, and surrender. He's going to explain these now. An aspiration that is vigilant, constant, unceasing, the mind's will, the heart's seeking, the ascent of your very life energy, the will to open and make plastic or flexible everything that you think and believe. So that's the aspiration. The rejection is the rejection of the movements of the lower nature, the rejection of the mind's ideas, opinions, preferences, habits, constructions, or conditioning, so that the true knowledge may find free room in a silent mind. Right? This is what we do in that Taoist Zen approach that we have on Tuesday nights. We empty the mind. This is a very important step. Otherwise, you can't get the new knowledge. You can't get the grace poured in. We're too busy. We're too conditioned. And so we have to reject this way of thinking and being and become very silent. But he also says this rejection isn't just through the mind. The rejection is also done through the vital energy, which are the demands, the cravings, the sensations, the passions, the selfishness, the pride, the arrogance, the lust, the greed, the jealousy, the envy, the hostility to the truth, so that the true power and joy may pour from above into a calm, large, strong, and consecrated, vital being. Right? And then surrender. Surrender of oneself and all one is and has, and every plane of the consciousness and every movement to be surrendered to the divine, to the Shakti, to the Great Mother. Okay? And he's saying when we do this aspiration, rejection, and surrender, we begin to attune to this deeper life, this deeper truth, this deeper power. You can call it the mother, right? These are symbols, but eventually you begin to experience it. And he says to walk through life armored against all fear, peril, and disaster, only two things are needed. What are the two things that always go together? The grace of the Divine Mother, and on your side, an inner state made up of faith, sincerity, and surrender. So grace will do its job when we are strong in our faith, unwavering, right? Have this sincerity that what we really want is the love and the peace and the joy of God or truth, and then we're willing to give up whatever's in the way of that. So he says, an egoistic faith is going to not be able to affect the change because it's full of its own ambition, its pride, its mental arrogance, its self-will. And he says this is like a low flame that's full of smoke, obscuration. It doesn't burn bright, right? So we know that our inner life, if it's obscured, confused, it's our sincerity, our level of surrender, our level of trust or faith needs to get turned up. It's not that there's no grace or the divine presence isn't there. We're blocking it through some selfish ambition, pride, arrogance, etc. Right? And then he says, regard your life as given you only for the divine work and to help in the divine manifestation. Let your sincerity and surrender be genuine and entire. When you give yourself, give completely without demand, without condition, without reservation, so that all in you shall belong to the Divine Mother, and nothing be left to the ego or given to any other power. The more complete your faith, sincerity, and surrender, the more will grace and protection be with you. You see how they go hand in hand. And when the grace and protection of the Divine Mother are with you, what is there that can touch you, or whom need you fear? A little of it even will carry you through all difficulties, obstacles, and dangers. Surrounded by its full presence, you can go securely on your way, because it is hers, careless of all menace, unaffected by any hostility, however powerful, whether from this world or from worlds invisible. Its touch can turn difficulties into opportunities, failure into success, and weakness and to unfaltering strength. For the grace of the Divine Mother is the sanction of the Supreme, and now or tomorrow its effect is sure, a thing decreed, inevitable, and irresistible. So this takes us to our final stop along the way this morning. This is a book by Sat Prem called The Mother, or Mother. It's the first of 3 volumes that he wrote about the partner of Sri Aurobindo, Mira Alfassa, who was considered an incarnation of the Divine Mother. Now, what we were just sharing about this Shakti, or this power, is this higher consciousness, or Holy Spirit, that can descend within us if we've made the temple clean, right? If we've surrendered, if our faith is strong, if we've purified the lower emotions and mental arrogance and self-will, with the temple being clean, then this Holy Spirit can move in us. We can feel this safety, this protection, this joy, this guidance, right? Thought by thought. Well, this is a story now where, as a little girl, Mira Alfassa, or the Mother, actually started to have this experience of this force, or this Shakti, descending. And Sat Prem writes so beautifully, so creatively. I hope you enjoy it. It really pops for me. And so he's talking about little Mira, 5 years old, escaping from her abusive mother and angry father, and going into her room and sitting in her specially made little chair. And she would tune out the world and tune in to this force that she had no words for. It was all instinctual at that stage. But it began to make its descent, and she felt it tactily, right? So Sat Prem said, it is Mother's very first experience, and it is the key to everything. Yes, a force which was like a consciousness, because it understood. It was comprehension itself, pure, unmitigated, and yet it was a force, because her senses perceived it first. A child needs to touch, to feel. It is a condensed mass about her which she pulled downward, and which filled her with well-being. Indeed, when that descends, one feels as if charged with freshness and light, just like a plant breathing. It even seems as if one breathed for the first time. Sri Aurobindo calls it consciousness force. It is the Shakti, the force. Right? Where else have you heard that word? It is the consciousness, force, the driver of the worlds. It is what men soon no longer understand and no longer feel, because they garb it in words, thoughts, colors, religious or political philosophies, music, and triumphantly declare, this is my thought, my music, my gospel, more or less noisily, depending on the intensity of the current passing through them. But it is one and the same current, passing and passing through everything, the atom, plants, and galaxies. When one touches it here, now listen to this. This is the non-locality of consciousness that he's going to be talking about now. That's why when Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, without leaving your room, you can touch the entire cosmos. Right? They knew this non-locality of consciousness from the earliest strata of mysticism. Now Sat Prem's going to be talking about this. When one touches it here, one touches it out there, thousands of miles away. In the most foreign individual or the most closed thing, and nothing is foreign anymore. Nothing is closed or distant or outside anymore, for everything flows within that and by that. It is what connects everything, the bridge to everything, the immediately here, the world's very substance, consciousness force, Shakti, the mother. He goes on, Mother is the foundation of the world's oneness, that which we try in vain to translate through equations, fraternity, or machines. All our telescopes, periscopes, telephones, and televisions are clumsy ways of recapturing this tele, which is at our fingertips, just before our eyes, in our fingers, and in our eyes. Instantly, like a little breath, which is the breath of everything, the key to everything, and ultimately the comprehension of everything. And so long as we do not rediscover this primal substance of the world, we will try vainly to bring closer what we have artificially driven away. So now he's saying something very insightful. Stay with me, we're just minutes till the end. He's saying, when we forget this ground of our being, when we forget this force or presence that connects everything and moves everything, we are out of alignment with the reality of real relationship. And so he's saying then, when we are trying to reunite brothers, right, if we have family squabbles, and we're disconnected from our own truth that binds us to all life, we have a very artificial understanding of what this relationship means and how to fix it. And we oftentimes will do it out of guilt, or we will try to patch things up, and we never really feel the connection the way it was. He's saying you can't reunite brothers. You can't heal broken relationships without first coming to realize your own deeper oneness with all of life. He says, and we can't force open frontiers or invade them, because they can only dissolve through this oneness. We can go to the moon and all moons until doomsday, but we will never fill the emptiness of our hearts and minds, which can only be filled here, because that is the fullness of the world, the life of life, the breath that carries all our vain words and music and all our moons, and which creates thoughts, music, and everything. We are the arrogant tools of a force we do not know, but which knows us well, and perhaps wishes a little more joy for us. If we would only consent to let it do its work instead of constantly interfering with our silly ideas, our silly philosophies, our silly religions, and all our silliness, which we are beginning to realize saves nothing, knows nothing, and can do nothing. So this reminds me of, coming back to the womb, right? Being like a little child again, like a little baby, knowing nothing, and then allowing this presence to teach us all things, right? So then we clean up, we have the experience, and then we can go out and extend this. Okay. Just a little bit more here. So now he's saying, when we go through these changes and we really want to wake up and we are emptying our minds, we are taming our lower nature, our ego drives, we become more and more still, more and more open, more and more quiet, our intentions are pure, we want the divine to indwell us, then we're going to go beyond our earlier conditioning, our limitations of thought, right? He calls it breaking the fishbowl here. We get out of the fishbowl. So when the bowl comes to the end of its evolutionary necessity, when those millions of beings can no longer stand to suffocate in a separate little me, to suffocate in pestilential thoughts and decaying words, to suffocate in their gospels that save nothing, their panaceas that cure nothing, their science that knows nothing, solves nothing, can do nothing, and mechanizes man in a colossal steel and concrete trap. Now listen to this. What's the trap? Where economic policemen will soon be kings. So he's writing this in 1976. And his forecast of where we are right now is spot on. Listen to this. If we don't get out of this limited worldview of self and wake up to this larger evolutionary arc that the Great Mother is opening up for us, listen to what will be waiting, this trap, as he's calling it. Economic policemen will soon be kings behind a front of non-existent liberty, non-existent equality, and non-existent fraternity. With 1,000 deadly parties tugging to the left or right to find out which is the best side to draw on, then the time is ripe for evolution to break the bowl. So when you see this on your horizon, Jesus says, right, when will the coming of the Son of Man be? Wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, a lot of frothing. Know that the time is near. He's saying it right here. Read the signs of the times. He's saying this is the catalyzing event for breaking the evolutionary bowl of this isolated little me and opening us up to who we truly are, right? But the idea that we have to realize is we can't ride that wave, that tsunami, if we haven't allowed this inner sadhana or practice to take root. We have to quiet, we have to purify, we have to clean up, because that wave's going to come and we're going to be washed away by it, or we're going to be lightened up enough to get on top of it and ride it up. Right? He says again, we are at that time. Our failure is our most marvelous hope. So when you see everything crumbling, chaos, the Antichrist is coming, right? This global police state and genocide and everything else that's in the works. This is our marvelous hope. Our failure is our most marvelous hope. The last convulsions of the old mental babble are opening on a new cycle, a supramental cycle, right? Going beyond the limited mind into Buddha mind or Christ mind. The most formidable illusion of all times is being shattered in a crash of rust and dust as if it never existed. And indeed, it never did. Separation never was. Consciousness was never divided. Spirit is not as we think it. Matter is not as we see it. And life, death, that first and foremost division, is neither life as we know it nor death as we think it, but something else. A radical something else, into which we are slowly emerging, as into a kind of bewildering and unexpected new birth. Even more bewildering and unexpected, and more total than the one that changed the reptile in its swamp into a bird in the sky, because this is a different being. It is not an improved extension of the same old evolution. It is a leap an evolutionary saltus into a different consciousness, for a different matter, a different law of being. For being differently is to have a different kind of power, but being begins with one drop. Now, I have probably overburdened you enough, but this one drop is what is found in every moment. We can't go into it further this morning, but this one drop is coming to this moment and allowing the divine, surrendering to the divine, and allowing the divine to begin to rebirth you into your true self, emptying out and allowing this recreation to take place. Okay? Enough said, probably too much. Blue bag's going to go around. Any thoughts, comments, or questions? John?
Yes, if you look at religious studies over the centuries, this rewriting of ancient script happens often. In your opinion, what portion of that rewriting is to promote spirituality and awakening versus what portion of that is to control the masses?
The cynic in me wants to answer first, and that would be, a lot of the rewriting was to bring these teachings more into a controlled environment, right? Because a lot of these rewritings were done for a monarchy to have a tighter grip or a church empire to have a tighter grip. It doesn't mean that the essence is lost, but it oftentimes gets polluted or distorted by these limiting dogmas of belief that cut us off from this one drop within this living moment and the transformation that's possible. Shall we? So, charging this with the intention that it go out as an example or symbol of the force. May it bring transformation and enlightenment to all minds in whatever form it may take. So it is. Amen. Final moment, comment, question, anybody? Okay, let's rise and seal the deal. So one of the things we might want to take today as our meditation is, as Sri Ramakrishna would say, all female forms, all women, all girls are expressions of the Divine Mother. So let your meditation of the Great Mother appear in every feminine form today. See the divinity in all women as direct expressions of the Lady. And in this meditation, we will come to realize that the light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. And the presence of God watches over us wherever we are. God is. Amen. Have a beautiful day, everyone. Again, happy Mother's Day.